Talk shoes. Recorded live.
Hello and welcome to the Castle of Horror interview segment where we talk to writers and creators of today's genre worlds from Denver, Colorado. I'm your host, Jason Henderson, co-creator of the steampunk graphic novel Clockworks, about a woman leading a team of mech pilots in Victorian London, out in paperback from Humanoids this month. Actually, next week is the street date. All right, today we're talking to USA Today best-selling author Kristine Rusch. Miss Rusch's novels have made bestseller lists around the world. Her short fiction has appeared in 18 Best of the Year collections. She's won more than 25 awards for her fiction, including the Hugo and the Asimov's Reader's Choice Awards. Her Chris Nelscott, that's a name. She has all of these different identities. Chris Nelscott writes mystery novels, and they've been nominated for almost every award in the field. She writes goofy romance novels as award winner Christine Grayson, romantic suspense as Christine Dexter, and futuristic SF as Chris DeLake. I love that name, actually, Chris DeLake. Welcome, Chris. You asked me to call you Chris. Welcome, Chris.
Yes.
Chris, whatever.
Thanks for having me here, Jason.
Oh, I'm so excited, and it's going to be so much fun talking to so many people at literally one time. I think it's going to be really cool. Okay, before we get started, your own fiction, your fiction is coming out all the time. I know you're writing under numerous names, you're doing a lot. But your own fiction is in a couple of bundles right now, and we've talked about bundles. It's where you can order, like, you pay one amount, some goes to charity, and you get a bunch of books. Can you talk about what you're in right now?
I'm in 3 different story bundles, and I didn't plan it this way. People asked me to be in bundles, and then they all kind of bunched up at the same time. The first one is the Epic Fantasy Story Bundle, and it has my novel Heart Readers in it, which is one of my favorite novels. It's set in a made-up fantasy world with 2 women who can read hearts, actually, and see, who's a good person and who's not, which is a plot device, and we have kings and all of that stuff. Brandon Sanderson's in it, and Tracy Hickman, and Kevin J. Anderson, and you're in it. And so, that's the first bundle. The second bundle is the Political Thrillers Bundle, which is running through the entire election. And
cool.
When I signed up for that one, I thought, it'll be nice to have some kind of make-believe stuff going on around the election, so that, because the elections are usually so dull. No, this is the thrillers in this bundle are probably more realistic than what's happening in the election right now. I have an alternate history called The Enemy Within that's in there, and it's set in 1964, and it postulates what would have happened if J. Edgar Hoover died the February after JFK, and so then it goes from there. And the third bundle just started this week, and it's the Extreme Science Fiction Bundle, and it kind of focuses on extreme sports in science fiction. And I have a novel in my Retrieval Artist series called Extremes.
Right.
And it's about a marathon on the moon. And so that one, and of course, because the Retrieval Artist series is mysteries on the moon, somebody dies at the marathon on the moon, and that's the beginning of the book.
It's a
so
mystery.
All 3 of those bundles are running at the same time, and you can get, each one is slightly different. You can get like 5 books for $5, or 10 or 11 books for $15, and there's all kinds of things you can do on the website. It's storybundle.com.
Very cool. Storybundle.com. That's where all of them are. And I also know that if you want, a certain percentage of your purchase price can go towards the chosen charity.
And in the Epic Fantasy Bundle, it's the Challenger Center that is the chosen charity. And even though I wrote down what the other 2 are, did I go and bring that piece of paper so that I could talk to you during the interview and tell you what they are? I can't remember. But the Challenger
Center is highly cool. I'll publish
a
link to it. So that's I need to do that anyway, mainly because not least of which because I have a book in the fantasy bundle, but I need to repost to everybody the story bundle stuff because it's really interesting and it's cool. And there's no DRM in the books. So
no, and you get introduced to writers you never would read otherwise, and that's what I usually download a story bundle every couple months just because there are writers I've never heard of and writers I have heard of who I haven't tried yet. So it's fun. It's a good way to get introduced to writers.
Oh, absolutely. And that's always such a treat too. Okay, speaking of that, because you were an editor and you are an editor, and I want to go straight to meeting writers that you've never encountered before. You are just now putting out a brand new anthology called Women of Futures Past, and apparently you worked with Toni Weisskopf. This is a Baen anthology? All right.
This one came out of Baen.
I've worked with her before. She was my editor on my first 2 books, in fact.
Oh, cool. Toni's great people.
She's wonderful. No, she's awesome. But I doubt she remembers who I am, because that's like literally 20 years ago.
I wouldn't doubt. Don't discount Toni.
But okay, so Women of Futures Past. What compelled you to put this particular anthology together?
Well, I had a very weird experience. I've been in the field for 30 years, the science fiction and fantasy field, the other fields too, but science fiction and fantasy in particular, and I'm a prominent woman in the field. And so, I won the Campbell Award in the early 90s, and which is the best new writer, and at the same time I became the editor of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. So, I mean, it was kind of hard to ignore me and all the other women that were in the field, and there were a ton of us. There were just a bunch of us, and we learned at the footsteps of, at the feet of other women.
Yeah.
And it was a no-brainer. Women were just in science fiction like men were in science fiction. Like nerds are in science fiction. They litter the landscape. And I was talking to some young writers just a couple years ago, and they kept telling me how hard it is for women to get published in science fiction and how there were never any women in science fiction. And, I would give them weird looks because they had come, many of them were my students, they had come to study with me, and I'm like, hello, female, been in science fiction a long time. What the heck? And so, I kind of got irritated, and I said, well, what about Connie Willis? What about Lois McMaster-Bujold? What about Andre Norton? What about C.L. Moore? And these young women would say, who? And I was like, what? Who? What do you mean, who? And, at first I just thought they didn't know anything, and they just hadn't explored the field. And then I was teaching a science fiction class, and what I do when I teach classes is I make sure that everybody reads the same thing so we can talk from the same perspective about fiction rather than citing movies as to, what to write. We cite the same stories.
Sure.
And so I decided after those conversations, you know what I was going to do? I was going to put an entire group of women in science fiction stuff in that so that these young women would be introduced to the women in science fiction. And I couldn't find any stories by any of the women that I had named, except, scattered in old anthologies that weren't.
Surely Lois McMaster-Bujold would be around.
No, Lois was in her own short story collections, but she wasn't in any anthologies that I could put with other writers. So that were easily available in ebook form and, other forms. They were hard to find, and I was frustrated. And I thought, what the heck? And so I started exploring, and I realized that in the year's bests, that over the turn of the century, even the best of the year, the best of the century, not all, most of the women had been left out. And I was like, what? And I had grown up reading things like the Hugo Awards, Volume 1 and stuff, edited by Isaac Asimov. He would always put together all the stories that were nominated for the Hugo every year. And then Isaac died in 92, and Connie Willis did one. And I thought, those have to still be around, right? They weren't. And there were the occasional Nebula volumes, but those were rare and hard to find, and often, again, not in ebook. So I said, this is weird. Women's fiction is being lost.
Yeah.
And because I went and talked to Toni at Kevin J. Anderson's Superstars Writing Conference. We were both there, and I mentioned this to her and found out she was as mad about all this women don't exist stuff as I was, and all these other women were really mad about it who'd been in the field a long time. As Eleanor Arneson says, what are we, chopped liver? We're here. We've been here the whole time. And so, I said to Toni, we just need a corrective. We need a new anthology that just shows not women writing about women's issues, because you can find those anthologies, but women just writing fiction.
Straight up fiction and science fiction, right?
Fiction and science, just straight science fiction, all the different subgenres of science fiction with male protagonists and female protagonists and protagonists who are not necessarily talking about gender issues or politics or anything else, or having babies. They're just dealing with stuff like you deal with in any other science fiction story. But I also wanted, the top quality ones. So I did some reading. I put it together. Tony was and is. All of Baen they are so supportive. They're right behind these books. They've got them going, and they're really promoting them. I'm very pleased, and it's getting quite a bit of attention, and I'm happy for it, because I'm hoping a whole bunch of other editors will now jump on the bandwagon and do a bunch of reprint anthologies that bring back a lot of lost fiction, because I found a lot of lost fiction as I was doing this.
You talk about extensively in your in your blog, which is fascinating. It's a really great blog. I have no idea how you have the stamina to write a blog post like that every day. It's not something I've tried. But
I write it every week, not every day.
Well, it's wonderful, okay? But you talk at length about some of the challenges of putting an anthology like this together. Like, sometimes you have this embarrassment of riches. You know, you have all these works, and you can't use all of them, especially because you admitted that you personally like longer short fiction. And can you talk a little bit about that?
I really like longer short science fiction, because it gives you time to build the world and really build it well, and then tell this expansive story. And I love that. And so those stories really spoke to me. Sometimes some of the shorter ones, I would be like, but I want to spend more time in this world.
Yeah.
But it really was an embarrassment of riches. I mean, there are so many great stories that are lost in dusty old books that need to be brought back, and they still feel fresh. That's the really cool thing. I mean, occasionally I'd come across one that has language that I would I wish the author was still alive so I could say, can we cut out this word because it's going to offend all of America right now? But the story is great.
On that? Let's say you're gonna publish a work, and it's a cool work, but you've got a couple of words that have just fallen so far out of favor that it seems facetious to even call it out of favor. If it's worth reading, at what point do you say to a student, you know what, you need to read this. Just don't even worry about it. You're going to be offended, and let it go. Read the story.
If you're doing a text book, I think you can do that. If you're doing a book that's trying to bring back old fiction and trying to bring people into the field like I was with this one, I don't think you can do it at all. But
would you have to seek the permission of the state?
It would be great to do an anthology of offensive fiction or something that's really good, that just has bad language in it. And then you could put an introduction saying, okay, this uses a word that is a hot button word. But, there are hot button words, and then there are the words that are so egregiously offensive now that they send you flying out of the story and you miss the point of the story. There was one story I read that was just wonderful, and I'm not going to use the word, but it was the word, it's a word that you use for Hispanics, white people use for Hispanics. It's really offensive. And the whole point of the story was about how discrimination is wrong. And nobody was discriminated against. Nothing happened that was bad, but all the way through, the white characters were referred to as white characters, and the Hispanic characters were referred to with that word. It was like, okay, the story was written in 1930. All right.
Yeah, even the concept of sensitivity was different back then. I was looking at I think it was called The King of Eolim, which was a science fiction book from the late 1960s, I think. And, in it, it's about a future world where everybody's super smart. And so this one guy's boy has just what we would today think of as completely average to intelligence, but he's considered, mentally deficient, and so they have to decide whether to kill him or send him off world or whatever, and he's ruining his career because everybody thinks as terrible he has a son and the word they use is retard, and they just throw it around it's terrible that your son is a retard. What are we going to do? And everybody just use the word over and over, and to my ears, it just clangs. We don't use that in polite public, polite society. And it's so strange to see that. You also, by the way, talked, just to switch tracks really quickly, you also talked about some cases where you saw female writers writing in ways that you regarded as almost, I don't even know, chauvinistic. writing a story that could be read as chauvinistic. And I wonder if you looked at that as, oh, this is like some sort of deep irony, or is this, what's going on there, and how did you grapple with that?
Well, what was going on was that the story was about something else, generally speaking, because I was reading science fiction stories. So, it might be, they might have been homemakers in space. There were writers that did write that in an ironic sort of way. Roselle Brown, she was an amazing writer, and she did that. I wasn't able to use one of her stories. I wish I was able to. But she was on my short list. And everything she wrote was snide or, a commentary on how weird it was to have homemakers. Same with Mildred Klingerman. Her stuff was always, Connie Willis is the heir apparent to Mildred Klingerman. They have the same kind of voice. They have the same kind of attitudes. But then there were a couple of other women that they'd write great stories, but in those stories, the men were the actors, and the women were either the reactors or the people who stayed home and baked cookies. So they just had absorbed their culture so much that they didn't think that if they were going to write a space opera set in the future, the person exploring the planets could be a woman.
Huh.
She would have to tag along with her husband. And
it's almost exploitative.
It was weird.
Well, I mean, I can imagine that person going, listen, I'm writing this for a particular audience. I know what that audience is demographically. I'm giving them what they want. Does that sound like something like the author would say, or what do you?
No, I actually think, because I read a number of works by some of these authors were highly acclaimed, and I read a number of their works. And when I'm saying a number, I mean like piles. And it was just there. It was in there. It was just in the attitude all the way through.
Wow. Well,
yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, it was very cultural.
That's fascinating. I mean, it probably makes for very interesting reading, some of those stories, but also the ones you chose. I love reading old science. Actually, I love reading any old work just for the view it gives you through the author of, someone's view of their society in that day. It also might tell you about an idea of what the future will be like or what they thought the future would be like. But it also gives you some inkling of what 1948 was like.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, that's 1984.
You got stuff from as early as 33, as 1933. And yes, you're right.
Yeah, that story, that's C.L. Moore, and boy, is that fresh. That story is it's a science fiction horror story.
What's it about?
Wow, I had to read it with one eye closed. The book as far away from me as possible. It was, and it's set, it's set not on Earth, and it's just scary. It's fun. It could have been written last week.
Well, oh wow, okay. Let me think. I wanted to. So at least with this kind of a work, you're reaching out to, I guess, estates. If you were to change language, you'd have to ask the estate, but you said you decided not to go ahead and do that. But in theory, you could, right? You could reach out to somebody's estate and say, hey, I want to take out some language. Would that be okay with you? And they might say,
I could, but I had an embarrassment of riches. I had 100,000 words from Bain, and Tony said, she wanted a substantive essay up front, 10,000 words. And I was like, well, I'd rather showcase the stories. And she said, no, we need the essay. And she was right. We did need the essay. So that left me 90,000 words of fiction. And when you were talking about, I decided to limit myself to the 20th century, starting with 1926, which is when a lot of people think, the current science fiction started, and went to the year 1999. And 90,000 words, to say that it's a drop in the ocean is such an understatement. I mean, there were hundreds upon hundreds of women writing short stories and hundreds upon thousands of short stories published. So I just kind of had to keep whittling it down and whittling it down and whittling it down. And so a lot of times if the story had a problem like language, or there was one that was set in what was clearly the Middle East. And I love that story. It's a wonderful story, but given the political climate right now, that story would have been the story everybody talked about, because was the author being prescient, or was she, being racist, or was she just writing something set in a strange world? They would have, and I thought, no, that one's too hot right now because of what's going on in our world. Had I, published this 10, 15, 20 years ago, it probably wouldn't have received any notice at all. So, maybe in 10 years I could publish it.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Well, and as you talked about, you can take different texts on different collections, and say, this is going to be a collection of read at your own peril kind of stuff, and this one will be, in mysteries, that's why they divide people up, and they go, all right, all y'all who want mysteries where there's never any gore and everything works out, cozies, you're done. There you go. And everybody who wants stuff that makes you want to kill yourself, here, we have those too. Mystic River, it's yours, and on and on. I love that, by the way. But one thing that you didn't have to do, which you've obviously done many times, is you didn't have to deal with collecting fiction from living people. Normally, tell me how it works. I assume it works like this. They say, hey, Chris, can you, by Christmas next year, deliver to us a collection of, I don't know, stories about aliens? And you go, sure. And then what do you do? And what do you do when you get that call?
Well, it depends on what perspective you want to take and how you want to do it. Let me clarify one thing. There are about 6 living authors in this book.
Oh, okay.
Women of Futures Past. It's just reprint stories. So, but you can contact living authors to answer your question. You can contact living authors and say, I need a story of 3,000 to 5,000 words about aliens, or you can they would be original stories. I know some people like Paula Gurin, who does great anthologies. She does half reprint and half brand new, and I'm not sure how she divides that up. The problem with an invite anthology, I have found, is that it doesn't matter how brilliant the writers you invite in, they're going to be uneven. Some of them will just toss off something that they feel is what I wanted, and they don't give it a lot of thought. And some people write something completely brilliant. I tend to prefer doing kind of open submissions, but not slush. Slush is when people you don't know send stuff in. My husband and my husband's Dean Wesley Smith. He's also a writer and editor. He and I are series editors on a bunch of books called Fiction River, and we're actually doing a Kickstarter subscription drive on that right now. So head over to Kickstarter and you can see what we're doing. And we work out of a pool.
Website, right? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Kickstarter.com. We work out of a pool of writers that we ask, a lot of times, would you write a story on this topic? And these writers are award winners. They're brilliant. They're fantastic. And then they know they may not sell the story to us, but they're there with a bunch of other people. And often, the last couple times we've done this, we've gotten 50 to 100 brilliant stories and had to whittle it down to 20. And I'm seeing a lot of the stories that we whittled down in the digest magazines, or in literary magazines in some instances, and in other anthologies. So it's great fiction that's getting out there in various ways. But that's kind of how I prefer to work with current authors. And then you go back and forth with them. You can say, this one word is offensive, let's move it, or this little passage here is murky, let's fix it, or something like that. Or write me another story in that same world. I love it.
Sure. If you're gonna do a follow up or anything like that, absolutely. Wow, that's really cool. One of the other things that struck me as I was thinking about, I had 2 thoughts. One, thinking about what you're saying about working with the writer and dealing with their language. I know that there have been times when I've been dealing with a publisher, and they'll say, I totally see why you had this character do this thing, or make this reference, or run out of the store naked at this point, or whatever it is. And they go, and we can do it that way, but just so you know, middle grade libraries will not stock it if you leave this in here. I've actually had that conversation,
Yep.
And I'll usually go, all right, I hear you. I want middle schoolers, so okay, fine. Then you can take that out. It's just amazing to me that the fiction that the editor and the author build together is a final work that is different from that which originally comes off of the author's keyboard or whatever it is.
Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. But I mean, editors are there for a reason, and they do help, especially on what I think my job as an editor is to make sure the story is clear on the page. And a lot of times writers have it in their head, and the manuscript is the tool to explain what that story in their head is. And I'm just refining the tool a little bit to make sure that the story is clear. And if I keep that in mind as my job, I don't mess with other people's stories too much, but at the same time, I also, will point out where an area doesn't quite work for the sake of getting that story on the page so the reader gets transported somewhere new.
Okay, I'm going to ask a really tough question, and maybe it's not answerable. But do you think that when you heard your students saying, I'm not aware of female writers, or it's difficult, do you think that the lack of female writers in those collections was out of an outright distaste for female writers, or out of a knee-jerk taking male writers more seriously without even any regard to what the bigger picture was going to look like?
I don't think either, actually, because I did think about that for a while, because I happen to know a lot of the editors who anthologize these stories. Now, the things
Right.
you have to know about, like Year's Best anthologies and other things, is, especially with Year's Best anthologies, a lot of the deadlines would be before the awards ballots came out. So they would the editors would pick what they thought were the best stories of the year, and the awards ballots would be different.
Yeah.
And so, there was always that aspect. But you could count on the page, there would be 20 stories and 2 would be by women. And I was like, well, I know these guys. And in a couple cases, they were women editing. And I was like,
Yeah.
I know these people. What is going on? And I really think it comes down to something that they've been studying across the nation now that happens a lot, and it's called unconscious bias, where you as a person are more drawn to people you consider like you. And stories are about people, and they're about experiences that are similar to yours. Some editors will pick things that either meet their taste or are similar to theirs or what they grew up reading, and they don't think about it. If you were to challenge them and say, hey, you're getting older, and so all of your stories in your Year's Best are about getting old, they would go, oh, whoa, thank you for pointing that out. Let me fix it. But nobody's pointed it out, and I think that happened for years. I think it just happened, and then there was no real corrective, like when I mentioned the Asimov volumes that were putting the awards together, the nominees of the awards. That was a corrective, because that way when you saw like a Hugo Awards volume, you knew that all the stories in there had been nominated, and it had nothing to do with the editor. You can't have unconscious bias in that unless the award is weighted one way or another. And so therefore, if like this year, all the winners of the Hugo were female, then all the stories in there are going to be female, whether the editor likes them or not. And I think those things need to be brought back, just kind of as a corrective, because it's hard. I just did a Best of the Year mystery and anthology, and after we had put it to bed, I worked with John Helfers on it. It's out now in ebook form from Kobo. It'll be out in paper form in a month or so. But after we had put the book to bed, the Edgars were announced, and we had read all the stories on the Edgar ballots, John and I, and we had rejected a whole bunch of them for a variety of reasons. And we had like 3 days to go, do we want to just insert these back into this volume or not? And we decided not to, because the Edgars didn't reflect what we thought were the best of the year.
You had already followed your own criteria.
Yep.
And that's totally fair. And it's also tremendously nice for the editor, for the authors that would have been jettisoned had you switched over had you let a couple more of the Edgars in.
Absolutely.
And you followed an honest criteria, so it makes total sense to me. I mean, it also has this benefit of growing the tent, so I'm totally down with that. That's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. I keep thinking about all these people you write under many names, and all of them appear to be female names. And I was just thinking about, like, I was looking at a Marilyn Ross Gothic the other day. Marilyn Ross is actually Dan Ross, living wherever the heck he was, and literally using his wife's name. I think because he just thought it was a good name. I don't think he was per se posing as his wife, but he just used a female name to write Gothic romance novels. S.E. Hinton. I think I was in college before I realized that S.E. Hinton was a woman.
I didn't realize it till she released a sequel to The Outsiders. And that was in the 90s when she did that?
I don't remember. Are you talking about?
Yeah.
It's not Rumblefish, is it? What?
No, I don't. It's somewhere in my office downstairs. It came out in the 90s. She did a bunch of more books, and
you got these pictures of her, and lo and behold, S.E. Hinton is a woman. By the way, those books are like 50,000 words long or less.
Mm-hmm.
That amazes me, that you used to be able to write a novel, and like if you were today to write a novel and it's 48,000 words, 46,000 words, and send it to a publisher, it wouldn't go anywhere. It couldn't go anywhere.
No, because they have traditional publishers. Now, this is changing back again now that people are publishing their own stuff. It's going to natural length, which the natural length of the story is whatever the story wants. But traditional publishers, the history of publishing has always been about that war between pricing and content. And in order for them to make money, they had to start raising prices on mass market paperbacks. And to justify the raised price, it didn't cost them a lot of money to add an extra few pages. So the book started getting bigger and bigger as the prices started going up and up. And, that's how we ended up with a 90 to 100,000 word novel. It had nothing to do with the fact that novels needed to be 90 to 100,000 words. It had to do with the fact that publishers said, we need to justify this cost so that readers are willing to pay more money.
That's really interesting. I don't think anybody had ever explained that to me. Stephen King, of course, he famously said, I like to write books as long as I like to, because he just likes that. He was like, why are people complaining? But he's the only author I've ever heard said, I wake up in the morning and want to write 200,000 word novels. That's my thing. That's amazing.
I occasionally like writing long stories. I just finished an 8-book arc, and each book was about 100,000 words.
Wow.
That's an 800,000 word arc in my recent
that blows my mind.
Called Anniversary Day. But then I just wrote a novel for my diving series that's about 50,000 words. So the story is what the story is, and that's fun.
That's really cool. Can I ask you about your process a little bit? I know you write under a lot of different names, as I mentioned. So at any given time, are you working on more than one book?
Yeah. Because there are more opportunities now, with self-publishing and you can go in traditional publishing and everything else. Every idea that I had that was not possible to sell into New York is now possible. And so I had to speed up. And I was already writing pretty fast. And so I decided, the heck with it. I'm going to work my normal 5 to 6 days a week, and half the week is going to be on one book and the other half of the week is going to be on the other. And to be honest with you, I didn't think that was going to work, but it does work, and it stops me from feeling frustrated. Because about midway through a book, I get tired of working on that same thing over and over again. I like to tell people I have a hummingbird brain. I light on something for a while, and then I light on something else. And doing it this way, it kind of makes my hummingbird brain happy.
Wow, that's really cool. Do you try and hit an amount, like every week, every night?
Yeah, it's 10,000 on each. 10,000 words
10,000 a week on each.
So I'm writing 20,000 words that week, not counting my blog.
Right.
And yeah.
I mean, that's a lot. I mean, that's really amazing. Do you split it into morning and evening, or I'm just trying to figure out how you arrange your day.
Well, you have to understand that my husband and I are childless, and our entire lives are about writing and reading. So, it does kind of, we have a lot of time. I split it into 3 sessions, 3-ish sessions, after breakfast, after lunch, and after dinner.
Well, it sounds like studying for the bar exam. That's
yeah, except studying for the bar exam sounds like it'd be boring, and I feel like writing is fun. So.
It is, telling you from experience, it is boring, but it does come to an end, so it doesn't last forever. But that's amazing, man. I mean, that is really impressive, because that's on average 20,000 words. It's over 2,000, closer to 3,000 words a day. Fabulous. Just, yeah. I mean, I tell myself, if I were a full-time writer, if I weren't spending all day doing, whatever big business kind of crap that I do all day, that, would I be able to put out that kind of words? It's really hard to guess. It's hard to know.
I was trained as a journalist, and we were required. You had a news story done, that day. And it might be 800 words. It might be 5,000. It just had to be done that day. And
but in that case,
training fits in early.
Yeah, it's training. Exactly. That's fabulous. I mean, that's really, really fabulous. Well, gosh, okay. Once again, if you want to get access to some of your stuff at a really neat offer, you are in 3 story bundles right now, which you can find at storybundle.com. Your new anthology that you want everybody to know about is called Women of Futures Past from Bain, and it is brand new, and it features a lot of science fiction from a lot of women throughout the 20th century. It's really cool. I kind of feel like we could probably talk for a really long time about some of the politics of choosing what goes in and so forth. But this is very interesting stuff, and I'm glad that you took the time to drop in and talk about it.
Well, thank you for asking me. This has been a lot of fun.
I'm glad. All right. Have a fantastic evening. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. You too. Bye-bye.